In this lecture, we're going to examine the fundamental basis for a couple of pathologies that affect the cardiovascular system. And what we'll specifically address is something called atherosclerosis. And this is a condition that is defined by the formation of what's called atherosclerotic plaque along the inner walls of arteries. We don't typically see this on the venous side, but we do see this on the arterial side. And some of the more common arteries that are susceptible to the accumulation of this plaque include the epicardial artery, the coronary artery, the iliac, and the femoral arteries as well. An important factor that drives the development of this plaque is inflammation, and that's something we'll address in a subsequent video. One of the problems that could result from atherosclerosis is what's called a thrombosis. And a thrombosis is specifically a factor that will cause an acute blockage in blood flow. And this obstruction could come from a blood clot or an excessive blood clot that breaks loose that gets wedged into a relatively smaller blood vessel, as well as atherosclerotic plaque. So the plaque is not a blood clot. Plaque is a long-term accumulation of various compounds that will effectively decrease the cross-sectional area of the lumen of a blood vessel, and that will make blood much more difficult to flow through that vessel. But to gain a better idea eventually of these pathologies, we begin by taking a review of the basic structure of the two major blood vessels of the cardiovascular system, or the two general categories, and those include those are arteries and veins. And the third vessel that we'll address as well is the capillary, which is found within what's typically called vascular beds. And as you can see here in this drawing on the bottom part of the slide, the endothelial cell that we'll discuss in greater detail shortly makes up the inner lining of the entire cardiovascular system and is the major component of capillaries. When we take a look at arteries, we see that in this drawing, the color red is used as opposed to the color blue for veins, and that indicates that the blood flowing through the artery is oxygenated blood. So blood that has been maximally loaded with molecular oxygen. And the color blue for the vein is used to indicate that we're looking at deoxygenated blood flowing through this vessel. Now, deoxygenated blood, as a reminder, refers to blood that has less oxygen than the arterial oxygenated blood. How much less oxygen it has depends upon the metabolic state of the body. One last point to make here is to recall that the oxygenated nature of the blood through this artery is specific to the systemic circulation and the coronary circulation, not the pulmonary circulation. The key feature of both of these major types of vessels include the endothelium, and this exists across the entire cardiovascular system. So that inner layer of veins and arteries is also the same tissue that lines the interior of the heart chambers. The major difference, or a major difference, between arteries and veins is the tunica media, which is composed of this relatively thick layer of smooth muscle that we see in arteries and a very thin layer found in veins. In fact, some veins in the body are devoid of this smooth muscle. So we see that on the arterial side, the regulation of blood flow is much more accomplished, because when the smooth muscle is activated, it will vasoconstrict the artery and redistribute blood flow to other areas of the body. The tunica externa is similar between arteries and veins, and this is composed largely of connective type of tissues that will anchor these blood vessels within the tissues through which these blood vessels move. The important element of the entire cardiovascular system, and this is going to be specific to arteries and capillaries, is what's called the endothelium. And the endothelium is a reference to the entire cardiovascular system. This includes the chambers of the heart, and it's referring to the inner layer of that closed loop. And on this diagram here we see the endothelium is made up of endothelial cells. The entire endothelium is considered an active organ. And being an active organ, it's composed of cells that carry out autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine functions. An autocrine function refers to the production of a chemical or a compound by a cell that will affect the operation and the metabolism of the same cell that made that compound. A paracrine function refers to a cell that makes a compound or a chemical that will affect a nearby or adjacent cell. And we'll take a look at that in this lecture shortly. An endocrine function refers to the production of a chemical or compound by a cell that will affect the function of a distal cell in the body. And the only way that that compound can get to the distal cell is being secreted into the blood and traveling through the cardiovascular system. So the endothelium is made up of cells that actually carry out all three functions. The overall purpose of the endothelium is to regulate vascular tone. And when we talk about vascular tone, we're referring to the contractile state of the smooth muscle. So this obviously affects the mechanical state of that tissue on the arterial side of the cardiovascular system. The endothelium will also produce compounds that will help to maintain a constant level of metabolism of the entire vasculature of the cardiovascular system. And when we get down to the capillary level, where the capillaries do not contain smooth muscle, the endothelial cells will allow various substances to diffuse into and out of the cardiovascular system. And this includes molecular oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and metabolic end products. To understand the function of the endothelial cells, we take a look at a typical artery that has a relatively thick layer of smooth muscle, and it's the smooth muscle that is very effective at either vasoconstricting the artery, if that smooth muscle is activated, or if the smooth muscle is relaxed, it will allow the artery to vasodilate. The lumen will grow larger. And once again here, we're looking at the most inner layer of the cardiovascular system, which are these endothelial cells. What we're going to specifically examine here is something called shear stress as a mechanical factor that will affect the function of the artery. Now, if we imagine blood is flowing through this model artery from left to right, we see that some of the major constituents of blood include red blood cells, and this is a depiction of H2O, which is the major molecule of plasma. And recall, plasma is a water-based medium within which various cells and other molecules are suspended. And as that blood is flowing through the artery, it develops what's called a velocity profile. And that velocity profile is described using what's called a vector. And a vector, in this case, is a graphical depiction of how fast that blood flow is going. And so we use an arrow to depict a vector. And this vector will illustrate the direction of blood flow and the magnitude of the velocity. So basically, how fast blood is flowing. And so we see that in the middle of the lumen of the artery, blood is flowing at its fastest velocity. If we take a look at the velocity vectors near the vessel wall, we see very short vectors here. And these vectors are very short because of the fact that velocity is lowest near the vessel wall. And the reason for this is something that was mentioned just a few minutes ago, is shear stress or friction. So friction is another term for shear stress, and that means that the portion of blood, the portion of that fluid that is making contact with the endothelium, which is the inner layer of the artery, that very high friction that's located right here will cause blood to flow very, very slow. But as we move away from the vessel wall towards the middle of the blood vessel, we see that a typical flow velocity profile is set up where there's a progressive increase in how fast that blood is flowing as we move from the most surface layer of the blood against the endothelium towards the middle of that blood vessel. Now, this flow will have an effect on the function of the endothelial cell. And so when that blood flow velocity might increase, so if we think about the heart producing greater force or contracting at a faster rate, the flow of blood will naturally increase. And that occurs with muscle contraction and physical activity. Now, as that blood is flowing faster, that portion of blood that's making physical contact with the inner lining of the artery will increase that friction. So something that's moving faster in contact will produce a greater shear stress. And so once again here, we're taking a look at this diagram here that depicts a single endothelial cell. And at the very bottom here, this is the tunica media. This is the vascular smooth muscle that regulates the size of the blood vessel. Now, with the endothelial cell is more than just the inner lining. The endothelial cell contains a protein inside the cell, and that protein goes by an acronym called ENOS. And ENOS stands for endothelial, because it's contained inside the endothelial cell, nitric oxide synthase. And the type of protein here is an enzyme because of the last three letters. So anytime we see these last three letters, that indicates that we're dealing with a protein that functions to speed up a chemical reaction. And this reaction is, this particular type of enzyme is going to synthesize. So it's going to make something, and the thing it's going to make is a compound called nitric oxide. Now, the factor that stimulates the endothelial cell to make nitric oxide, once again here, is the blood flow. So recall that the portion of blood that's making contact with the endothelial cell is moving very, very slowly, comparably to the blood flow in the middle of the artery lumen. And that's illustrated by this very short vector. However, we see a very large vector, And this very large vector is the vector that is characterizing what we use as a symbol, Greek letter tau, T-A-U. And Greek letter tau is the symbol for friction or shear stress. So right against the vessel wall, we see very high shear stress, that friction causing blood to flow very, very slow. Now, that shear stress will deform that endothelial cell. And that occurs particularly if there's something that's increasing blood flow, such as increased physical activity. And so we see a deformation. So this is a stretching, if you will, of the endothelial cell. And that mechanical stretching will activate eNOS. And when eNOS is activated, it will bind an amino acid inside the cell called L-arginine. And when L-arginine binds to this enzyme will initiate a chemical reaction and convert L-arginine into what's called an amino acid derivative, L-citrulline. Now, citrulline is not considered an amino acid, but it's considered an amino acid derivative. But the conversion involves the release of a compound called nitric oxide, one nitrogen atom and one oxygen atom taken off of L-arginine. Now, the increased production of nitric oxide is carrying out the paracrine function. So nitric oxide will leave the endothelial cell, will enter the smooth muscle cell adjacent and nearby the endothelial cell, and nitric oxide will interfere with the vascular smooth muscle's ability to produce force. As a result, nitric oxide will induce smooth muscle relaxation, and when the smooth muscle relaxes, that vessel will dilate or will increase in size and allow that tissue to accommodate more blood flow. More blood flow means that more oxygen can be delivered to that tissue. So this ends part 1C of our unit.